Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, The Invitation to Hawthorn Hall. The letter arrived on a damp, windblown Thursday evening, just as Hercule Poirot was finishing his modest supper of sole meunier and a perfectly symmetrical portion of green beans. He had set down his knife and fork precisely parallel on the plate when the bell rang. Miss Lemon entered with her usual crisp efficiency, holding out a cream envelope upon a small silver tray. "It was delivered by hand, Monsieur Poirot," she said. The messenger declined to wait for a reply. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and took the letter delicately between finger and thumb. The handwriting upon it was elegant and looping, each letter formed with the precision of one long schooled in the art of penmanship. He examined the paper first, good quality, faintly scented with lavender, and smiled. "Ah, Miss Lemon, already this letter speaks of breeding, refinement, and perhaps one petite tragedy." Miss Lemon, who did not believe in tragedies except those that involved misfiled papers, inclined her head and withdrew. Breaking the seal, Poirot unfolded the letter and read, "Lady Agatha Hawthorn requests the honour of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's company at Hawthorn Hall, Gloucestershire, for the weekend of All Hallows Eve. A matter of great delicacy and some distress compels this invitation. We beg you to consider our hospitality and your discretion as a kindness to a troubled household. Yours sincerely, Agatha Hawthorn." Poirot reread the letter slowly, his grey-green eyes narrowing with interest. "All Hallows Eve," he murmured. "How suitable for a matter of great distress." He tilted the envelope toward the lamplight, noting a faint watermark, Hawthorn Hall, 1692. He rose, pacing to the window of his tidy flat overlooking Whitehaven Mansions. Outside, London glistened faintly beneath a drizzle of rain, the lamps reflected in the puddles like rows of flickering eyes. A family in the country, an ancient house, a lady with troubles. ABN, Hastings would call it the perfect setting for ghosts. But ghosts, I do not believe in. He smiled faintly. Criminals, yes. Ghosts, none. Within the hour, he had written a polite note of acceptance and instructed Miss Lemon to arrange his travel for the following morning. He would take the early train from Paddington to the Cotswolds. The journey the next day was uneventful but for the steady curtain of rain that blurred the countryside into a watercolour of browns and greys. Poirot sat by the window, immaculate as ever, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the gloom. Opposite him, a farmer with muddy boots and a newspaper offered a curious glance but, finding Poirot's expression serenely self-contained, returned to his headlines. At the small station of Wycliffe-on-the-Wold, a chauffeur awaited him with an umbrella and a discreet bow. The car, a stately black Daimler, smelt faintly of leather and wood polish. As they drove, the lanes narrowed and twisted, climbing through rolling hills mottled with mist. The driver spoke little, but when they passed through the rusted iron gates of Hawthorn Hall, he said quietly, "Begging your pardon, sir, but they say the hall's not been right since the master died. Some say you can hear the clock striking in the night, though it hasn't been wound for years." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? Clocks, monsieur, like people, have their secrets." The car swept up a long drive flanked by yew trees whose branches interlaced like black fingers. The house itself emerged from the fog, a great, stone edifice with mullioned windows and ivy crawling up its facade like green veins. The air was heavy with damp earth and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Lady Agatha awaited him in the entrance hall, her figure framed by a great oak staircase that wound upwards into shadow. She was a tall, slender woman in her late 50s, her silver hair drawn into a chignon, her gown of black velvet lending her the look of a portrait come to life. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low and cultured, though tinged with nervous tremor. "How good of you to come." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madam, it is my pleasure. You spoke of a matter of delicacy." She hesitated, glancing toward a large grandfather clock that dominated the hall. Its face was pale and cracked, its hands motionless at 9. Yet as Poirot's gaze rested upon it, a faint tick sounded, like the heartbeat of something long dormant. Lady Agatha's gloved hands tightened upon one another. "It began again last week," she murmured. "After 20 years of silence." "Indeed." Poirot approached the clock, his keen eyes noting the dust along its base and the faint marks of recent polishing near the pendulum window. "You say it was silent for 20 years. Why, then, did it wake?" "I do not know." She drew a deep breath. "It has not struck since the night my husband died. He fell from the tower, an accident, they said. But I have never been sure. And now it begins to strike again, though none have touched it. Last night, it chimed once, at midnight." Poirot studied her intently. "And this troubles you because you fear the hand of the supernatural?" Lady Agatha's eyes flickered. "Because, Monsieur Poirot, I fear the hand of the guilty." At that moment, footsteps sounded upon the marble floor. A young woman entered, a striking figure in a scarlet scarf, her dark hair loose and eyes bright with intelligence. "Aunt Agatha, forgive me for interrupting." She turned to Poirot with a polite nod. "Miss Evelyn Hawthorn. I am delighted to meet you. I've read about your cases in the Times." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "And I, mademoiselle, am delighted to make the acquaintance of one who has such taste in scarves. It is most becoming." She smiled faintly. "I'm afraid you'll find Hawthorn Hall rather dull company, Monsieur Poirot. Unless, of course, you like your mysteries served with candlelight and superstition." From somewhere deep within the house, a door creaked shut. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Ah, but superstition, mademoiselle, is often the mask that conceals reason. And reason, she is always worth pursuing." Lady Agatha gestured toward the great staircase. "You must be weary from your journey, Monsieur Poirot. Your room is prepared." As he followed her up the steps, Poirot could not resist glancing back at the clock. Its pendulum had begun to move, slowly, rhythmically, though no one had wound it. The faint tick-tock, tick-tock echoed softly through the hall like a whisper in an empty room. Later, as Poirot unpacked his valise and arranged his brushes neatly upon the dressing table, he looked out of the tall window. The evening mist thickened around the lawns, and the yews stood motionless, like sentinels guarding secrets too old to tell. He smiled to himself. So, the clock that strikes without a hand. The widow who fears a curse. And a house where silence speaks. Ah, mon ami Hastings, if only you were here, you would declare at once that we have entered a haunted tale. But no, he touched his temple lightly, the little grey cells will reveal the truth, not the phantoms. Below, in the hall, the great clock ticked on. Somewhere in the darkness, a single chime sounded, soft, low, deliberate. Poirot listened, head slightly inclined. "Bon," he whispered. "The game has begun." Chapter 2, The Guests at the Hall. The next morning dawned grey and windless, the gardens of Hawthorn Hall shrouded in a pale mist that blurred the outlines of every hedge and statue. From his window, Hercule Poirot watched a solitary gardener moving among the rosebushes, the shears flashing faintly in the weak light. The stillness of the house was almost unnatural. He was dressing with his customary care, his tie precisely knotted, his shoes polished to a mirror gleam, when a gentle tap came at the door. It was Miss Evelyn Hawthorn, already brisk and alert, her hair neatly coiled and her manner touched with that modern self-assurance which Poirot found both refreshing and faintly amusing. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Aunt Agatha asked me to tell you breakfast is served in the morning room. I hope you slept well." "Excellently," Mademoiselle, Poirot replied. Though I confess, I dreamed that the clock downstairs was having a conversation with me. It is perhaps an indication that even in my sleep, my mind refuses to be idle. Evelyn smiled. I'm afraid that clock has disturbed many a night's rest in this house, even when it wasn't ticking. My aunt insists it's a family heirloom. I'd have it taken to the village and burned. Ah, but that would be to destroy the witness before one has heard its testimony, Poirot said lightly. One never knows, mademoiselle, what secrets an old clock might conceal. They went down together. The morning room overlooked the east lawn, and the pale light of day struggled through lace curtains, falling upon a breakfast table laid with silver and porcelain. Seated at the far end was Lady Agatha, looking drawn yet composed, a small dog asleep upon a cushion beside her chair. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, she said, with a faint attempt at cheerfulness. I trust the night brought you rest, not disquiet. Rest, madam, always. Disquiet, never without reason. Poirot inclined his head courteously and seated himself. Around the table sat the other residents of the hall, each introduced in turn by Lady Agatha with the quiet authority of habit. Closest to her was Dr. Lionel March, the family physician, a tall man with iron-grey hair and a complexion like parchment. His expression was calm, but his eyes, small, pale, and sharp, missed nothing. Dr. March has been with us for more than 20 years, Lady Agatha said. He was here in my late husband's time and has been a great support to me. A man of science, madam, is often a great comfort to those plagued by mysteries, Poirot replied. Opposite the doctor sat Mr. Henry Vale, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a neat moustache and the firm, cautious demeanour of the legal profession. Mr. Vale handles the family's affairs, Lady Agatha added. He was also my husband's solicitor. Vale inclined his head. And your arrival, Monsieur Poirot, is most opportune. Lady Agatha has suffered much anxiety of late. We shall be glad to see her mind at ease again. Poirot's gaze lingered a moment on the lawyer's steady hands, strong, capable hands, with the faintest trace of ink on the right thumb. He noted it and tucked the detail neatly away. Last of all was Mrs. Black, the housekeeper. She was a small, angular woman of indeterminate age, with a stern mouth and eyes that seemed to see both more and less than they revealed. Her voice, when she spoke, was unexpectedly soft. We do our best to keep things running smooth, sir, she said. Though this old house has a will of its own. Doors creak when there's no wind, fires smoke when they please, and that clock, she lowered her voice, that clock's been the heart of it all. Poirot spread his napkin over his lap and regarded her thoughtfully. The heart of it all? A curious choice of words, madam. She gave a small shrug. You'll understand soon enough. Breakfast continued with polite conversation, though beneath the surface ran a current of unease. Dr. March spoke little, content to butter his toast with mechanical precision. Mr. Vale discussed estate matters in dry tones. Lady Agatha tried to smile but often lapsed into silence, her gaze drifting towards the doorway that led into the great hall beyond, as though she half expected the old clock to appear there of its own accord. Poirot noted every glance, every hesitation. The atmosphere was not one of open hostility but of suppressed tension, like a drawing room where a quarrel has long been postponed but never resolved. When the meal was over, Lady Agatha invited Poirot to accompany her on a short tour of the house. Evelyn excused herself to tend to correspondence, Mr. Vale retired to his study, and Dr. March disappeared without explanation, his footfalls echoing down a side corridor. Lady Agatha led Poirot through rooms heavy with the scent of Polish and faded roses, the library, the music room, and at last, the hall itself, where the clock stood tall and grim against the panelling. It was a magnificent piece, carved oak, brass fittings dulled with age, the Roman numerals on its face worn by time. Poirot examined it closely, noting a thin layer of dust upon the upper casing, but the faintest smear near the keyhole, as if a finger had touched it recently. "Who wins this clock, madam?" he asked. "No one," she replied. "Not for years." Poirot bent slightly, his moustache twitching. "Then someone has shown it affection lately, I think. Perhaps it was curious to know if it still had a voice." Lady Agatha shuddered. "You think someone has tampered with it?" "I think, madam," Poirot said gently, "that clocks, like people, do not move without motive." He straightened and gestured toward the great staircase. "And where did your husband meet his death?" Her lips tightened. "From the tower above that landing. He fell late one night. It was raining. They said he slipped." "They said?" Poirot repeated softly. "Yes. There was an inquiry, of course. No evidence of foul play. But I have never forgotten that evening. I heard voices, angry ones. Then silence, and the sound of his fall." Poirot regarded her gravely. "And you suspect someone in this house?" Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling. "I do not know what to suspect anymore. But now that clock chimes again, on the very nights when the wind is still. Perhaps it seeks to remind us. Or to accuse," Poirot said quietly. At that moment, footsteps echoed along the corridor. Evelyn appeared, a letter in her hand. "Aunt Agatha, this arrived by the morning post. It's from the bank in Cheltenham." Lady Agatha took the envelope, her expression tightening as she read. "It says there are irregularities in one of the estate accounts," she murmured. "But that cannot be, I signed no such checks." Poirot's brows lifted. "Irregularities?" "TNs. It appears the hall hides more than one ticking mechanism." Lady Agatha looked up sharply, but Poirot's expression was mild, almost benign. He bowed slightly. "If I may, madam, I would like to examine your clock more closely this afternoon. A small matter of curiosity for the little grey cells." "Of course," she said faintly. "Whatever you need." As Poirot returned to his room, the sound of the clock followed him, steady, rhythmic, almost taunting. Yet as he reached the landing, he paused and looked back down the long corridor. There, half shrouded in shadow, stood Mrs. Black, watching him with expressionless eyes. Poirot inclined his head politely. "A fine morning, madam," he said. She did not reply. When he reached his door, he murmured softly to himself, "Yes, this house breathes secrets. And soon, perhaps, it will exhale them." Behind him, far below, the clock began to tick louder. Chapter 3: The Shadow in the Corridor. The day passed with a strange quiet that settled upon Hawthorn Hall like a heavy curtain. Even the servants moved more softly, as though the very walls were listening. Hercule Poirot spent the morning in the library, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound volumes whose gilt titles glimmered faintly in the half-light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the sunbeams that filtered through the high windows, and from somewhere distant came the steady tick of the ancient clock. Poirot had requested the key to the clock's casing, but none could produce it. It was lost years ago, Lady Agatha had said. Yet Poirot was certain someone had found it again. The faint smudge near the keyhole, the dust disturbed upon the casing, these were the whispers of a secret hand. He spent much of the morning in quiet observation. He watched Dr. March crossing the terrace with long, deliberate strides, his hands clasped behind his back. He noted Evelyn hurrying from the post-room, her expression troubled. And once, he glimpsed Mrs. Black standing near the door to the tower, her face turned toward the upper window, as though listening for something unseen. At luncheon, conversation was sparse. The clinking of cutlery filled the silences between awkward phrases. Poirot, ever courteous, steered the talk toward the neutral and the trivial, the recent fashions in London, the late blooms in Lady Agatha's rose garden, but beneath the politeness, the air trembled with unspoken fears. When the meal ended, Poirot excused himself to stroll the grounds. The October air was damp and cool, heavy with the scent of wet earth. He followed a narrow gravel path that wound past the lake. The water lay still as glass, reflecting the grey clouds above. He paused, gazing thoughtfully at the tower that loomed beyond the trees. "That," said a voice behind him, "is where my uncle fell." Evelyn Hawthorn had come quietly, her red scarf fluttering in the faint breeze. She stood beside him, her arms folded. "Forgive me," she said, "but I thought you should know what no one else dares to say." "Then you are very courageous, mademoiselle," said Poirot gently. She hesitated. "Uncle Edward didn't slip. He argued with someone that night. I heard it from my room. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a man's voice, and it wasn't my aunt's." Poirot turned his gaze upon her keenly. "And did you tell this to the police?" She shook her head. "Dr. March told me not to. He said it would only distress Aunt Agatha and that there was no proof. I was 17. I believed him." "Ah," murmured Poirot. 17, a time when one trusts too readily. "But tell me, mademoiselle, who else was here that night?" "Dr. March, of course. Mr. Vale came the next morning. And Mrs. Black, she's always been here." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci. You have the gift, mademoiselle, of observation and of conscience. I suspect both will soon be needed again." She looked at him, a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Do you really think there's danger in the house, Monsieur Poirot?" He smiled faintly. "Danger? Perhaps not yet. But unease, yes. It moves through the corridors like a draught one cannot find the source of." That evening, as twilight deepened, the house gathered once more for dinner. The long dining table gleamed under the candlelight, each place setting arranged with precision. Yet the atmosphere was brittle, and every sound seemed too loud, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon, the sigh of the wind beyond the windows. Lady Agatha spoke little, her gaze fixed often on the clock through the open doorway. Poirot noticed her hand tremble when, precisely at 9 o'clock, a faint tick sounded, followed by the slow, ghostly swing of the pendulum. Dr. March set down his wineglass. "It is nothing but mechanical interference," he said brusquely. The movement must have retained some residual motion. Poirot's moustache quivered. "A curious phenomenon, Doctor. Particularly for a mechanism untouched in 20 years. Mr. Vale frowned. "Are we to discuss the clock every evening, Lady Agatha? Surely Monsieur Poirot has more rational matters to occupy him." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, monsieur, but sometimes the irrational conceals the rational most effectively. It is the veil, not the face beneath, that demands our first attention." A faint smile touched Evelyn's lips. "I should like to see the day when a veil could hide anything from you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot spread his hands modestly. "Ah, but veils are designed to flatter. I, mademoiselle, am interested only in the truth, and she is often less flattering." The meal ended early. One by one, the household withdrew. Poirot lingered in the hall after the others had gone, standing before the clock. The pendulum swung steadily, each motion precise, hypnotic. He leaned closer, listening. Tick, tock, tick. Then, suddenly, silence. The pendulum stopped. Poirot straightened, eyes narrowing. He reached out, fingers poised just above the glass door of the clock, when a faint sound reached him, a footstep, light and deliberate, on the upper landing. He looked up. A shadow moved along the gallery above, tall, indistinct, gliding rather than walking. Poirot's sharp eyes caught a glimmer of red in the dimness, like the trailing thread of a curtain cord. "Tiens," he murmured softly. "A color most curious to choose for nighttime wandering." The figure vanished at the end of the corridor. Poirot climbed the staircase silently, each step deliberate, his senses alert. But when he reached the gallery, the passage was empty. The only sound was the soft rustle of the curtain stirred by a draught. He examined the floor. The carpet was thick, but near the balustrade a small object caught his eye, a single red thread, no longer than an inch. He picked it up carefully and turned it between finger and thumb. A thread from a garment? Or perhaps, from a plan. Returning downstairs, he examined the clock again. The same shade of red was looped faintly around the base of the pendulum. Not tightly, merely brushed against it, as if by accident. Poirot's expression sharpened. "No, not accident," he said aloud. "There are no accidents so precise." At that moment, a low moan echoed faintly from somewhere above. Poirot turned his head sharply. It was followed by a crash, the sound of glass shattering. Within moments, the household came running, Evelyn pale with alarm, Lady Agatha clinging to the banister, Mr. Vale shouting for lights. They found Poirot at the base of the staircase, calm and composed. "It came from the east corridor," Evelyn gasped. Poirot nodded. "Let us proceed, with order, if you please." They followed the trail of shards to a small upstairs window. The night air poured through the broken pane, cold and sharp. Outside, the wind had risen, stirring the trees into a restless whisper. Lady Agatha's voice trembled. "What does it mean?" "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, what does it mean?" Poirot turned to her, his face grave. "It means, madam, that someone walks these halls who prefers the darkness to the dawn." He stooped, examining the sill. A fragment of mud clung to the stone, and beneath it, a partial footprint, small but distinct. Poirot looked up at the faces around him, the frightened widow, the anxious niece, the wary lawyer, the silent doctor, and the housekeeper standing at the back, her expression unreadable. "The house," he said softly, "is no longer content to keep its silence." Chapter 4: Bay Whisper from the Past. Morning came pale and uneasy. The storm that had rattled the windows through the night left behind a brittle calm, as though the air itself held its breath. The household gathered at breakfast in silence, each person absorbed in private thought. Only Poirot seemed untroubled. His moustache gleamed immaculate, his poached egg was eaten with mathematical precision. When the meal ended, Lady Agatha rose abruptly. "I shall be in the library," she said. "There are letters I must attend to." Poirot stood and bowed slightly. "If I might join you, madam?" "It is always wise, I think, to put our thoughts in order when the heart is disordered." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, perhaps that would be best." They went together down the long corridor to the library, where the scent of old leather and beeswax filled the air. The curtains were drawn back, and pale autumn sunlight lay across the rows of books. The great clock in the hall could be faintly heard, ticking like a pulse beneath the stillness. Poirot, his eyes ever roving, noticed a small desk in the corner, old mahogany, its drawers slightly warped with age. Lady Agatha moved toward it and drew out a stack of letters. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through them. "I have lived here nearly 30 years, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly. "But since Edward's death, the house has changed. I cannot explain it, it listens, it remembers." Poirot's gaze rested on her gently. "Madam, houses remember nothing. But people, they remember too much." He stepped closer to the desk. "If you will permit, I should like to look through these records of your late husband's affairs. Sometimes, the dead speak through paper." Lady Agatha hesitated. "There are drawers here that have not been opened since his death." "Then," said Poirot simply, "it is time they were opened." With her nod of assent, he knelt and began to examine the drawers carefully. In one, he found old correspondence, estate bills, bank statements, invitations yellowed with age. In another, a collection of family photographs. But the third drawer resisted. The lock was stiff, and when Poirot at last coaxed it open, a faint puff of dust rose, carrying the dry scent of time itself. Inside lay a single, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was cracked, the initials E.H. embossed faintly in gold. Poirot turned to Lady Agatha. "Your husband's hand." She nodded, her face pale. "Yes. That was his diary." Poirot placed it gently upon the desk. "Then, madam, shall we listen to what the past whispers?" He opened the diary. The handwriting within was firm, deliberate, the script of a man accustomed to order and authority. The entries were brief, noting weather, meetings, and business concerns. But as Poirot turned the pages, the tone began to shift. "I no longer trust those about me," one entry read. "Too much is concealed beneath civility. A week later, I shall confront the matter directly. If I am right, there is deception here, perhaps betrayal." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A confrontation," he murmured. And this entry, dated the very day before his death. He read aloud. "I have uncovered deceit within my own house. Tomorrow I shall confront the guilty. If this is my last entry, let it stand as my warning." Lady Agatha gasped softly, a hand rising to her throat. He knew. "I always suspected, but he never told me what he had discovered." Poirot closed the diary with quiet reverence. "You say, madam, your husband fell from the tower. It is not inconceivable that what he'd confronted at that night was his killer." Lady Agatha sank into a chair. "Then why has it taken 20 years for the truth to stir?" Poirot's eyes drifted to the window, where sunlight trembled through the mist. "Because, madam, secrets, like clocks, run down when left alone. But wind them again, and they begin to speak." Later that afternoon, Poirot requested that the clock be left untouched until nightfall. "It is possible," he said, "that our ghost keeps to a timetable." Dr. March frowned when he heard this. "Surely, Monsieur Poirot, you cannot be serious. You intend to sit up with that infernal machine?" "But of course, doctor. One must always observe the patient before making the diagnosis." "Patient?" The doctor gave a short, humorless laugh. "You speak as though the clock were alive." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps it is only the guilty who give it life." That silenced him. The evening drew in early. By 9 o'clock, the house had grown hushed. Poirot sat in the hall beside the clock, a small notebook open upon his knee. The others had retired, Lady Agatha pleading a headache, Evelyn to her room, the doctor to his study, and Mr. Vale with an air of irritation. Only the fire kept him company, its glow flickering across the carved oak panels. The pendulum hung motionless. Poirot checked his watch, 11:45. "Now, we shall see," he murmured. The silence thickened. A draught whispered through the corridor, carrying the faint scent of roses and damp stone. The flame in the hearth flickered, then steadied again. Then, at precisely midnight, a soft chime sounded, once, clear as glass. Poirot looked up. The pendulum had begun to swing, smooth and steady. He rose, moving closer. The clock face glimmered faintly, its brass hands gleaming like gold against the pale dial. He watched them intently. Another chime. Then another. From somewhere above, a faint creak echoed, the sound of a floorboard disturbed. Poirot's eyes sharpened. He turned toward the staircase. A figure moved on the landing, slight, hesitant, cloaked in darkness. Poirot called softly, "Who is there?" No reply. The figure turned and vanished into the shadows. He climbed the stairs swiftly, every sense alert. The corridor was empty, but on the floor, near the entrance to the tower stair, lay a single candle, still burning. Wax dripped onto the carpet in slow, glistening beads. Poirot bent and picked it up. The holder bore the faintest smudge of lipstick. He smiled faintly. A lady's candle, then. Tiens. The plot thickens and illuminates itself, a little. The next morning, the household was in turmoil. Mrs. Black had discovered the tower door standing open, though it was always kept locked. Poirot accompanied her to see it. The stairs were narrow, spiraling upward into shadow. At the top lay a small platform where a single window looked out upon the lake. Dust covered the stones, yet there, unmistakably, were footprints. Poirot knelt, examining them. Small. A woman's shoes, I think. Mrs. Black's lips tightened. There's wickedness about, sir. I've served this house 30 years, and I've never seen peace since that fall. Mark my words, the hall's remembering. Poirot looked up, eyes keen. Or perhaps, Mrs. Black, the living are reminding it. By afternoon, he had drawn a small map of the house, marking each sighting, each footprint, each curious sound. In the margin, he wrote one question in neat script. Who wound the clock? And beneath it, a single word, why? He sat back, fingertips pressed together. Yes, he murmured, the hands of the clock are moving again. But whose hand set them in motion? As the sun sank beyond the trees, the light through the windows turned the air to gold. Poirot closed the diary, rose, and looked once more toward the hall. The clock ticked softly, a sound almost human in its persistence. And beneath it, faintly, as though from the very stones of the house, came another sound, low, rhythmic, and disturbingly like a heartbeat. Poirot smiled thinly. You whisper, Hawthorn Hall, he said. But I, Hercule Poirot, I shall make you speak. Chapter 5, The Vanished Doctor. The morning broke cold and heavy with mist. Hawthorn Hall, with its ivy-draped towers and silent corridors, seemed half asleep beneath the dim October light. The great clock in the hall had ceased again, its pendulum frozen mid-swing, as though it too were holding its breath. Hercule Poirot descended the staircase with the calm of a man accustomed to strange beginnings. He paused in the hall, glancing once at the clock before making his way toward the breakfast room. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp linen. Somewhere above, a door banged softly. When he entered, only Lady Agatha and Evelyn were present. Lady Agatha sat rigidly upright, untouched tea before her. Evelyn looked pale, her eyes ringed with worry. Dr. March has not appeared. Poirot asked. Lady Agatha shook her head. No. Mrs. Black says his bed was unslept in. Poirot's brows lifted slightly. Ah. Then the doctor keeps unusual hours. Evelyn glanced up quickly. He's missing, Monsieur Poirot. We've searched the study, the terrace, even the tower stairs. He's gone. Poirot inclined his head, neither surprised nor alarmed. And when, mademoiselle, was he last seen? Lady Agatha answered in a low voice. He retired after supper, said he had medical notes to complete. That was shortly after 10. Poirot stirred his coffee thoughtfully. Then between 10 and dawn, the good doctor chose to take a walk, or to disappear. Either possibility is interesting. Evelyn frowned. You make it sound as though he chose to vanish. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but choice, mademoiselle, is often disguised as circumstance. He rose from his chair. Permit me. I should like to see the doctor's room. Dr. March's chamber was at the far end of the east corridor, overlooking the lake. The curtains were drawn, the air faintly perfumed with pipe smoke. A glass still stood upon the bedside table, half filled with brandy. Poirot examined it with delicate precision. "Still warm," he murmured. "He was here recently, then." "But not long." He moved about the room, inspecting every detail, the folded dressing gown, the stack of medical papers, the slippers neatly arranged. Nothing suggested haste or panic. And yet, something was wrong. Poirot crouched beside the writing desk. The chair had been drawn back slightly, and upon the carpet beneath it, faint scuff marks interrupted the dust. As though someone had turned the chair quickly, or risen in surprise. He opened the desk drawers. In one, he found a packet of letters tied with red thread. He untied it carefully, glancing through the contents. They were from the late Sir Edward Hawthorn. The first few were routine, about Lady Agatha's health, household accounts, and weather. But the final one, written only 2 days before Sir Edward's death, caught Poirot's eye. "Dr. March, you were mistaken if you thought I should not learn of your deception. You have overstepped your bounds, sir. Tomorrow I shall settle the matter publicly." Poirot's brows lifted. Tiens. So the doctor and the master of the house were not always in harmony. He slipped the letter back into its bundle, retying the thread exactly as before. As he turned, a movement at the doorway caught his attention. Mrs. Black stood there, her face unreadable. "You're not likely to find him, sir," she said quietly. "The hall takes what it wants." Poirot regarded her with mild curiosity. "Madam, the hall is a fine house, but I do not think it walks abroad at night. Tell me, when did you last see the doctor?" "Before supper." "He seemed troubled." "Pale, I thought." "Said he'd been down to the lake for air." "The lake," repeated Poirot. "Always the lake." He thanked her and went down the stairs, his steps silent on the carpet. The lake lay beyond a fringe of yews, its still surface veiled by mist. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold metal. Poirot walked slowly along the edge, his eyes moving with mechanical precision over every inch of ground. At the far end of the bank, he stopped. Something dark lay half buried in the reeds. He knelt, parting the grass delicately. It was a hat, Dr. March's hat. Damp, but not soaked. Poirot examined the inner band and found a faint smear of something red, not blood, but thread. The same fine, scarlet thread he had already seen. He straightened slowly, the mist curling around him like smoke. "A thread runs through every story," he murmured, "and this one is red indeed." Footsteps crunched behind him. It was Evelyn, clutching her coat tightly around her. "Have you found anything?" she asked breathlessly. "Only a hat," Poirot said gently. "But sometimes, mademoiselle, a hat is enough to tell the mind of a man." She glanced nervously toward the water. "Do you think he—" "Oh, I cannot bear to say it." "Drowned himself?" "No. That would be too simple, and the good doctor was not a simple man." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Poirot's eyes narrowed. A faint mark led away from the bank, 2 small indentations, as though something heavy had been dragged. He followed the line with measured steps until it vanished into the grass. "Gone. The plot thickens, and the ground, she tells tales." Back at the hall, Poirot summoned the household to the drawing room. The fire crackled, the shadows lengthened against the walls. Each face reflected a different shade of apprehension. Lady Agatha trembled. "You found him?" "No, madam. But I have found where he has been." "Near the lake." Mr. Vale's brow furrowed. "An accident, perhaps." "Possibly," Poirot replied evenly. "But the doctor's hat lies beside the water, while his shoes remain in his room. You see the difficulty." Vale's mouth tightened. "If you suggest foul play, Monsieur Poirot, you go too far." Poirot's voice was calm. Monsieur, when one goes in search of truth, one must go as far as truth itself. Tell me, did you see Dr. March after 10 o'clock? I did not. Nor you, madam. He turned to Lady Agatha. She shook her head. No. Poirot nodded slowly. Then perhaps it is time we consider why he disappeared. He turned his gaze toward the fire. The late Sir Edward wrote of deceit within his house. He accused the doctor of some deception. That same doctor vanishes after the clock begins to chime again. Coincidence, you will say? I, Hercule Poirot, do not believe in coincidence. A tense silence followed. Evelyn's voice broke it. What will you do now? Poirot smiled faintly. Observe, mademoiselle. Always observe. The answer she hides in plain sight, like dust upon the mantelpiece. But beware, dust may be moved by any hand. He bowed slightly and turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused and looked back. Lady Agatha, he said softly, the clock, has anyone wound it since yesterday? She frowned. No, Monsieur Poirot. Not since you examined it. He inclined his head. Then, madam, it appears someone else has taken an interest. For while you sat here, it struck once, very softly. Her eyes widened. You mean? Poirot raised a finger. I mean, madam, that someone walks the hall by night, and uses time as both servant and signal. The question now is, to whom does the clock obey? As he left the room, the great hall echoed faintly behind him. The clock ticked once. Then, very softly, it chimed 12, though it was not yet noon. Poirot smiled to himself. Ah, he whispered, time itself wishes to speak again. Chapter 6, Secrets at the Lake. A fog heavier than any before lay across the grounds of Hawthorn Hall the next morning. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their branches lost in white silence. From somewhere deep within the mist came the sound of dripping water, a slow, relentless rhythm, like a clock counting unseen moments. Hercule Poirot stood by the window of the morning room, hands clasped neatly behind his back. The lake, though invisible in the haze, pulled at his thoughts like a magnet. Somewhere beneath that still surface, he felt, lay the answer, or at least part of it. He turned as Mrs. Black entered with a tray. Your tea, sir, she said. It's a wicked morning. The air bites. Poirot accepted the cup with a nod. Merci, madam. The English weather, it has all the temperament of a jealous lover. First the storm, then the silence. One never knows which is worse. Mrs. Black gave a stiff smile. Aye, sir, but better a storm than stillness. Storms pass. Stillness lingers. When she left, Poirot sipped his tea in thoughtful quiet. Then, at 9 o'clock precisely, he stepped out into the fog. His small frame seemed swallowed by the white air as he walked toward the lake. The mist parted slightly as he reached the bank. The water lay still and pale, reflecting only a dim patch of sky. Poirot examined the reeds where he had found the doctor's hat. The red thread still lingered in his pocket, thin as a whisper, yet bright as blood. He knelt and studied the ground again. Footprints had blurred in the night damp, but new impressions appeared further down the path. 2 sets, one heavier, one light. He murmured, ducks persons. 1 man, 1 woman, perhaps. And they walked together, toward the lake, not away from it. A voice startled him. You are early abroad, Monsieur Poirot. It was Evelyn Vale, her coat drawn tight, her breath visible in the chill. She looked anxious, eyes darting toward the water. So are you, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. A walk before breakfast, how admirable for the health. She hesitated. I couldn't sleep. This fog, it feels alive. Poirot smiled faintly. You English, you have a wonderful imagination. Yet sometimes imagination hides what reason can reveal. Tell me, you were fond of Dr. March. She flushed. Fond? He was a friend, nothing more. Ah. Poirot's moustache twitched. But sometimes, the friendship of a woman is the envy of another, or the irritation of a jealous man. She looked away. You mean Philip Vale? He was jealous of everyone. He despised Dr. March's influence over my mother. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Influence? Of what kind? Evelyn sighed. Financial, emotional, everything. After father's death, mother depended on him for every decision. Philip hated that. He thought the doctor was after her money. And was he? She hesitated. I don't know. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. You are honest, mademoiselle. It is refreshing. Now, one more question. Did you ever see the doctor and Lady Agatha quarrel? Yes, she said after a pause. Once, late at night. I heard voices in the library. He said something about the truth coming out. Mother told him to leave at once. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Très bien. Then the lake is not the only place where things are hidden. He looked toward the water again. Mademoiselle, I think it is time we disturb the peace of this lake. It has kept its secret long enough. By noon, a gardener and a constable from the village had arrived at Poirot's request. They brought with them a small boat and a length of rope. Lady Agatha objected at first. It is indecent, Monsieur Poirot, to drag the lake like a common pond. But he only bowed. Madam, indecency is preferable to ignorance. And the lake, she waits to confess. They began at the shallower end, near the reeds. The boat rocked gently as the constable lowered the rope again and again, pulling up only weeds and silt. Poirot watched every movement, his face expressionless, eyes sharp as glass. Then, on the sixth cast, the rope snagged. The constable frowned. Feels like wood, sir. Heavy. Pull carefully, Poirot instructed. As the rope tightened, a dark shape broke the surface, an old wooden box, sodden and slimy with moss. It thudded against the side of the boat. Bring it ashore, Poirot said quietly. They dragged the box to the bank. The lock had long rusted away, it opened with little effort. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a bundle of papers, and beneath them, something metallic. Poirot lifted it out delicately with a handkerchief. It was a small, ornate key. Lady Agatha, who had followed at a distance, gasped. Why, that looks like the key to Edward's desk. Poirot nodded slowly. The desk where we found his diary, OUI. Yes, but that drawer was always locked. The key vanished after his death. We thought that it was lost, Poirot finished. And yet here it lies, hidden in the lake. The question, madam, is who placed it there, and why? He turned to the papers, unwrapping them with care. They were letters, their ink blurred by years of damp, but the handwriting was unmistakable. So Edward's, Lady Agatha whispered. Poirot read a few lines aloud. If anything should happen to me, it will be by the hand of one who fears exposure. The deception lies close, closer than I thought. He folded the letter again, expression grave. This was written shortly before his death. Someone feared discovery enough to silence him, and later, to conceal the evidence. Evelyn shivered. But who could have known about the box? Someone who had access to the key, and the strength, both of arm and of fear. Poirot looked toward the hall. There is much deception in that fine house, mademoiselle. It seeps through the walls like damp. That evening, the mist lifted slightly, revealing a crimson sunset streaking the lake. The air felt charged, waiting. Poirot sat alone in the library, the recovered letters spread before him. He studied them as a chess player studies his board. At last, he spoke aloud, softly, a doctor, a lady, a jealous man, and a clock that strikes where time stands still. Mon Dieu, it is elegant, this pattern of deceit. Almost too elegant. He leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled. The good Dr. March, he disappears. But his disappearance, it is not an ending. It is the beginning of the truth. The door opened quietly. Lady Agatha stood there, her face pale. Monsieur Poirot, she whispered, must you go on with this inquiry? Every hour you dig into the past, I feel the house itself tightening around us. Poirot rose and bowed slightly. Madam, when a wound is long ignored, the pain deepens. To heal, one must cut deeper still. She trembled. And if the wound kills us all? Poirot's gaze softened. Then, madam, it will be because the truth was long overdue. As she turned to leave, a faint sound echoed through the hall, the clock, striking once. Poirot listened, eyes narrowing. Again, he murmured. Always one chime. Not the hour, but the signal. Someone plays with time as a musician with notes. But soon, the melody, it will be complete. He gathered the papers and placed them neatly in his case. The lake outside shimmered in the last of the light, still and secret no longer. Poirot smiled faintly to himself. You may whisper, Hawthorn Hall, he said softly, but I, Hercule Poirot, shall make you confess. Chapter 7, The Gathering Storm. By the time dusk fell over Hawthorn Hall, the air was thick with unease. Every corridor seemed to hold its breath, even the portraits on the walls appeared to watch in silence. The servants moved quietly, speaking in whispers as though afraid to wake something that slumbered in the very bones of the house. Hercule Poirot sat in the library, that chamber of shadows and secrets, surrounded by papers, notes, and the diary of Sir Edward Hawthorn. His lamp burned low, casting a golden circle upon the desk. Outside, the wind stirred the last leaves of autumn against the windows with a dry, whispering sound. The clock in the hall ticked faintly, the sound threading through the silence. Poirot leaned back, eyes half closed, listening. He knew the rhythm by now, regular, patient, almost human. And yet, sometimes, it faltered. As if the house itself hesitated to breathe. When the door opened, Poirot did not look up. He merely said, "Come in, if you please." Lady Agatha entered, her face drawn and colourless. She wore a dark shawl that made her appear ghost-like against the lamplight. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "the servants are frightened. They hear footsteps at night, and last evening, Mrs. Black swears she saw a light moving near the tower window." Poirot smiled faintly. "Perhaps Mrs. Black has seen the reflection of her own curiosity, madam. But I thank you, such fears, they tell me much." Lady Agatha clasped her hands tightly. "Have you discovered the truth, Monsieur Poirot?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I have discovered enough, madam, to know that truth does not rest easy in this house. It lies beneath masks of grief, of loyalty, of love, but it lies none the less." Her breath caught. "You speak in riddles." "Not riddles, madam. Clues." He rose gracefully. "This evening, if you would be so good, I shall ask everyone, yourself, Miss Vale, Mr. Vale, and Mrs. Black, to gather in this room at 8:30. The moment has come when all must be laid bare." Lady Agatha's eyes widened. "Tonight?" "Oh, madam. Ce soir. Before the clock strikes again." The gathering was tense from the start. The library, usually a refuge of order, felt charged with invisible electricity. The heavy curtains were drawn, the great oak fire burned low. Outside, the wind had risen to a restless moan that rattled the panes. Lady Agatha sat near the fire, pale and composed. Evelyn stood behind her, arms folded, eyes downcast. Mr. Vale paced near the window, smoking nervously. Mrs. Black lingered at the back of the room, her face shadowed. Poirot stood by the desk, immaculate as ever, his silver moustache glinting faintly in the firelight. "My friends," he began, "I thank you for your patience. We have all endured a most strange visitation, a clock that chimes though unwound, a doctor who vanishes into the mist, and a shadow that walks by night. But let us be clear, there are no ghosts at Hawthorn Hall. Only guilt, memory, and fear." Mr. Vale gave a short, derisive laugh. "Fine words, Poirot. But unless you've conjured the doctor out of thin air, we are no wiser." Poirot turned to him with the mildness of a man unbothered by insolence. "On the contrary, monsieur, we are very close to wisdom, though you may find it uncomfortable." He lifted a paper from the desk, one of the letters recovered from the lake. This, you will recall, was written by Sir Edward on the eve of his death. In it, he speaks of betrayal within his house. But there is something curious about the signature. He held it up to the light. It is written not in Sir Edward's usual ink, black, but in blue. And the handwriting, though skilled, bears the faint tremor of imitation. Lady Agatha frowned. "You mean, it was forged?" "Precisely, madam." Evelyn gasped. "But who?" Poirot raised a finger. "Patience, mademoiselle. The letter was forged by someone who wished to direct suspicion away from themselves and toward another. Someone who had access to Sir Edward's study, to his papers, and, perhaps most important, to the key that we found hidden in the lake." His gaze moved from face to face, resting finally on Mr. Vale. "Monsieur Philip Vale, you were the last person known to quarrel with Dr. March, were you not?" Vale stiffened. "That's absurd. I've had nothing to do with any of this lunacy." Poirot's tone remained calm. "You are certain? And yet, on the night of the doctor's disappearance, you told Mrs. Black you were retiring early, though your shoes bore fresh mud the next morning." "Mud from the lake path, monsieur." Vale's face darkened. "You're imagining things." Poirot smiled thinly. "I imagine nothing. I observe." "And I observed, too, a faint thread of red wool caught upon your cuff, the same thread that marked the doctor's hat." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Evelyn turned to him in shock. "Philip, no." But Poirot's voice was gentle. "Do not judge too soon, mademoiselle. Monsieur Vale may have gone to the lake, but whether to kill or to conceal another's crime is the question." He turned slightly. "Lady Agatha, it is time you spoke the truth. You have been silent too long." Lady Agatha's lips trembled. I do not understand." "Non, madam. You understand perfectly. 20 years ago, your husband discovered that his physician, Dr. March, was more than a mere doctor. He was also your confidant and your lover." The word struck like thunder. Evelyn cried out softly. Mr. Vale stared in stunned disbelief. Poirot went on, his tone quiet but inexorable. "Sir Edward confronted Dr. March that night in the tower. There was a struggle. The doctor, fearing ruin, struck him, not with intent to kill, perhaps, but the blow was fatal. He staged the fall to appear an accident. And you, Lady Agatha, knowing the truth, chose silence, to protect him, to protect yourself, and perhaps to protect your daughter from scandal." Lady Agatha's face had turned white as paper. How could you know this?" "The diary, madam. The final entry, unfinished, because your husband was interrupted. The ink had not dried when the page was smudged by a second hand. Yours. You closed the book over wet ink. She gave a soft cry and buried her face in her hands. Yes, it is true. I thought it ended that night. But how could I have known the past would rise again? Poirot's voice softened. Because the good doctor returned, not as a ghost, but in person. He came back to claim what you promised him years ago, silence, and perhaps a portion of your wealth. You refused. There was another quarrel, and he disappeared once more, this time, forever. Evelyn whispered, "You mean mother?" But Poirot shook his head. No, mademoiselle. It was not Lady Agatha who dealt the final blow. He turned slowly toward the back of the room. Mrs. Black. The housekeeper's face hardened. You've no proof of that. On the contrary. You served this house faithfully, but your loyalty was not to the mistress. It was to the man who once promised to marry you, Dr. March. You discovered his secret with Lady Agatha, and when he returned, you followed him to the lake. There, when he threatened to expose her, you struck him down. The red wool from your shawl bound the letters you threw into the water. Mrs. Black's breath came fast, her eyes wide with fury and fear. He deserved it. He ruined everything. For her. For all of them. Poirot inclined his head sadly. Perhaps. But justice, madam, she cannot be kept at bay forever. For a long moment, only the wind and the crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then, from the hall, came a single, hollow chime from the clock. Poirot turned toward it, his voice quiet. You hear? The clock strikes for the last time. Time herself bears witness, and she waits for no one. Chapter 8, The Final Revelation. The room lay in stunned silence after Mrs. Black's outburst. The great fire had sunk low, the embers glowing a dull crimson, casting long, shifting shadows upon the walls. Outside, the wind keened softly around the towers, as though the house itself mourned what had been revealed. Mrs. Black stood rigid, her face grey and her hands clenched at her sides. Lady Agatha wept quietly, head bowed. Evelyn clung to her mother, pale and trembling. Mr. Vale, his arrogance now melted away, sat motionless, staring into the fire. Poirot remained standing, immaculate and calm, as though untouched by the storm of human emotion before him. He adjusted his cufflinks, then spoke, his voice low and measured. My friends, he said, you have heard a confession, but only part of the truth. There remains yet one mystery unsolved, one shadow that lingers. The question still stands, who wound the clock? Evelyn looked up, bewildered. The clock? What does that matter now? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Mais ouï, mademoiselle. It matters most of all. For the clock has been our silent witness. It struck when it should not, and it ceased when all else was still. It is the very heartbeat of this case. He turned and gestured toward the doorway. Come. You shall see for yourselves. They followed him into the great hall. The clock stood tall against the wall, its gilded face catching the flicker of the firelight. The air was heavy, almost reverent. Poirot approached it with delicate precision. Observe, he said softly, the beauty of its construction. Every mechanism perfect, every gear precise. Yet, for 20 years, it has stood silent. And then, suddenly, it begins to strike again, but only once, and always at midnight. He opened the glass panel and pointed to the pendulum. It moves, yes, but not by its own power. The spring is wound, but not enough to drive it naturally. It has been manipulated, wound by hand, at precise intervals. But the mechanism that releases the chime. He pressed a small lever. A faint metallic click echoed, followed by a single, clear chime. This lever, mess as it may darm, is connected to a hidden compartment. One that opens when the clock strikes. Behold! With a deft motion, Poirot pressed the base of the clock. A narrow drawer slid open beneath the dial. Inside lay a small velvet pouch and an envelope, yellowed with age. Lady Agatha gasped. Edward's handwriting. Poirot lifted the envelope and handed it to her. "Oh, madam. It was placed here by your husband himself, and concealed for 20 years by those who feared what it contained." Her hand shook as she opened it. The paper inside was brittle, the ink faded but legible. She read aloud, her voice trembling. "If I am found dead, this letter shall explain all. I have learned that my physician, Dr. Charles March, has deceived me. He has used his influence over my wife for his own gain, and I fear he means to silence me. Should harm befall me, let this stand as my accusation. The truth is here, in the key to my desk, hidden where none will find it. Trust only the clock. It alone keeps honest time." A sob escaped Lady Agatha's lips. Poirot took the letter gently from her and continued, "You see, the clock was both his guardian and his testament. Sir Edward hid the letter within its mechanism, but the doctor, or perhaps Mrs. Black, later, discovered it. They dared not destroy it, for that might reveal more suspicion. Instead, they left it hidden, and wound the clock only enough to test that it remained silent." Mr. Vale spoke hoarsely. "Then who wound it again now? Who made it strike after all these years?" Poirot turned, his gaze sweeping the group. "Ah, that, monsieur, is the most curious detail of all. For it was none other than you." Vale recoiled. "Me? That's nonsense." Poirot smiled thinly. "Not deliberately, perhaps. You recall, 2 nights past, you sought to prove the clock harmless. You pulled the pendulum, you touched the weights, you disturbed what had lain still for decades. You reactivated the very mechanism that Sir Edward himself had designed as his final safeguard." He stepped closer, eyes gleaming with that unmistakable brilliance. "You see, Sir Edward was not only suspicious, he was ingenious. The clock was built to chime not by time, but by motion. Any disturbance to its casing released the lever that sounded the bell. It was his final alarm, a message from the grave." Evelyn whispered, "Then, the clock was never haunted?" Poirot's voice softened. "No, mademoiselle. The clock spoke not from the dead, but from the truth long buried." Mrs. Black gave a bitter laugh. "And what good does it do now?" "He's dead." "They're all dead." Poirot turned toward her. "It does much good, madam. For though you struck the blow that silenced the doctor, it was not you alone who carried guilt. Lady Agatha's silence made her complicit, and the house itself, became the tomb of truth. Now it is freed." Lady Agatha rose unsteadily. "You mean to hand her over to the police?" Poirot's expression softened. "I mean to hand over justice, madam. Whether that justice is served by law or by conscience, that is not for me to decide. But know this, Dr. March's body lies near the lake's edge, beneath the stones by the boathouse. I have already informed Inspector Hargreaves. He will arrive by morning." Mrs. Black's shoulders sagged. "Then it's finished." Poirot regarded her gently. "Non. It is begun. The truth, she has been silent too long. Now she breathes again." Later, when the others had gone, Poirot lingered alone in the hall. The firelight danced across the face of the clock. It ticked steadily now, rhythmic and calm, its secrets finally spent. Hastings might have said something sentimental at such a moment, about justice, or ghosts laid to rest, but Poirot only smiled faintly. He ran a gloved finger over the polished brass and whispered, "You have done your duty well, mon ami. You have kept honest time." From the upper corridor came the faint sound of Evelyn's voice, soothing her mother. The air felt lighter now, less oppressive, as though the house itself had sighed in relief. Poirot turned to leave. But before he did, the clock chimed once more, soft, delicate, final. He paused and listened. Then, with a small nod, he said quietly, "OUI. That is the sound of truth, never loud, but always exact." The following morning dawned clear and cold. Mist rose from the lake in thin curls like smoke. A police launch glided silently toward the shore, Inspector Hargreaves standing tall at the prow. Poirot, immaculate in his grey suit and bowler hat, stood waiting beside Lady Agatha and Evelyn. "The body," said Poirot softly, "will confirm all. Dr. March's skull bears the mark of a blow, the same paperweight missing from your husband's desk, Lady Agatha. Mrs. Black took it, as she took your silence, and made it her weapon." Lady Agatha nodded faintly. "You have brought peace, Monsieur Poirot. Though I wonder if I deserve it." Poirot looked at her gravely. "Deserve, madam? Perhaps not. But peace, she comes to all in time, even to those who hide from her." He turned toward the hall once more. The autumn sunlight glimmered upon the windows, the ivy shimmered green and gold. It looked, at last, like a house released from memory. Poirot adjusted his hat and smiled. "And so," he murmured, "the case of the silent clock is wound to its end. The mechanism of deceit is dismantled, and only truth continues to tick." He glanced once more toward the great clock, its pendulum swinging smoothly, rhythm restored. "Exactment," he said softly, "as it should be." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped into the morning light, the little grey cells once more triumphant, the ghosts of Hawthorn Hall silenced at last by reason, precision, and the quiet justice of time itself.